Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the Legal Provision Act of God and what situations qualify for it. We will also talk about the tennis giant Novak Djokovic being kicked out of the US Open. But first, we talk about the Russian COVID-19 vaccine. The vaccine developed by Russia called Sputnik 5 has been in the news a lot over the past few weeks for being the first in the world to be authorized for general use. But the way it has been approved has led it to face criticism from experts across the world. Last week, in a major development, the medical journal Lancet published the results of the Phase 1 and Phase 2 of its clinical trial data. In this segment, Kaunain Sheriff, who reports on health for the Indian Express, joins us to talk about why it has faced criticism, what its clinical data reveals, and which countries have shown interest in it so far. Colin, there has been a lot of talk about the Russian vaccine in the news. It is being called the first in the world to be authorized for general use. What do we know about how this vaccine was developed?
So the Russian vaccine has been named as Sputnik 5. It's an adenovector vaccine, which means that you have this adenovirus. Commonly, viruses found in the chimpanzees, which cause the common cold. You modify them and you put the glycoprotein of the COVID-19 virus on this. And then when you induce the virus, there is a reaction in the body and check whether the body develops antibodies. It's a similar technology that is being used by Oxford. The vaccine was in news. We didn't know more about this vaccine in terms of what has happened in terms of the clinical trials. But last month, the Russian president announced that the vaccine has shown immense positive results in terms of tolerance, and it did not induce any adverse reactions, and hence has been cleared for public use, which means that there were no clinical trials of the phase 3, which are the larger clinical trials, and it had been cleared by the regulators in Moscow. Here, the vaccine was developed and the trials were conducted by Gamaleya Research Institute in Moscow. So, yeah, questions were raised. How can you have a vaccine for public use without conducting the phase 3 clinical trials? So, this is what we knew. But last week, we had a big development in the sense the phase 1 and phase 2 data was released on the medical journal, The Lancet. First, we came to know that the clinical trials in these two phases was conducted only on 76 people. That's the first thing. Second, it was tolerant, that it did not have any adverse reactions, that it also generated what we call as both cellular immunity, that is the T cell immunity, and the humoral immunity, which is the antibodies. So both were generated. What levels, how does it match with the convalescent plasma, that is the patients who recover from coronavirus? All of those details are given. But again, like I told you, it's just phase 1 and 2 and conducted on 76 people. So these are very, very preliminary results. This is what we know so far on the Russian vaccine.
You mentioned that it faced criticism because it's been approved for general public without phase 3, and we know a small group of people were used in phase 1 and 2. Could you just elaborate on that and tell us about, what risks does a vaccine run when these phases are not conducted properly, or, in this case, not conducted at all?
So generally, if you're seeing what is happening in the coronavirus vaccine trials which are going, is unprecedented. That means they're fast tracking almost everything. So there's one reason for that is even as early as in January this year, data was shared by the Chinese researchers about how the virus looks like. So based on that, then you had a lot of preclinical stage, that is before phase 1 of the human trials, being fast tracked, and you have so many of them right now in stage 3. That is the first part of coronavirus, the vaccine program, that everything has been fast tracked. You had the Moderna from US, which was the first to go into preclinical, and then you had the Oxford from Britain, okay, and then you had Pfizer from Germany, and India you have Bharat Biotech, which are all in phase 3 of trials. However, what is different with the Russian vaccine is that although this process has been fast tracked, but none of the other vaccines have been cleared by their regulators to be used for public use before the phase 3. But however, Russian vaccine was being cleared without phase 3 being cleared for public use. So what does this mean? In phase 1, all you do is you have a very small group, maybe in hundreds, all are healthy individuals, and you test what we call as reactogenicity, which means that whether you're developing any adverse reactions. The most common adverse reactions could be cold, fever, or something more adverse, then this first stage is just stopped. So far, in most of these big vaccine programs, none of them have developed any adverse reactions. In the stage two, which is a larger group, maybe goes into 300 to 800, and sometimes even in 1,000. You have a larger group. Okay, again, healthy adults. Okay, then you check the immune response. Okay, in coronavirus, you're checking both the antibody, what is the levels of the antibodies that are being generated, as well as if there is what is called as the T cell immunity, which is the cell mediated immunity. So both are being administered. So once you find that these two are showing positive results, then you test it on a very large population, okay, where you also include an elderly group, you also include people with comorbidities to check whether the vaccine is safe. The word is called safety of the vaccine, whether it's safe to be administered on a general population. This is the process which takes years and sometimes decades. For example, HIV is still in phase 3 after 3 decades of its clinical trial. But right now we have at least 6 of them which are in the phase 3 in the world. However, the Russian vaccine, it is not in phase 3. It was given a license just after it completed phase 2, and the results are there in the land. So this is a big criticism, that you're administrating a vaccine without actually following the set scientific guidelines that are followed from centuries.
And what interest has this Russian vaccine seen from other countries, including India?
So India specifically, had 2-3 weeks back sought details, because the WHO publishes all the results once they go from stage to stage. However, what we call as the landscape document. However, the Russian vaccine landscape document, the results of the phase 1 and 2 are not available. So India, which is talking to several manufacturers across the world, also then was asking or seeking information from the Russian institute, which is the Gamaleya Research Institute. The Indian ambassador Venkatesh Verma was the nodal officer there. So right now, India is just looking at the data. However, the Russian Direct Investment Fund, which is actually the nodal financial agency which is looking into the Russian vaccine, claims that there are several countries who are interested in buying this vaccine. It says Saudi Arabia, UAE, Brazil, Philippines. It talks about Mexico. All of these countries, it says, are interested in buying their vaccine. It also says that it starts production this month. But we really don't know, in the sense we have other vaccine candidates where you're officially signing agreements with the research institutes or the developers. But here we still don't know which all countries have actually signed the deal. But the official website says that UAE, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Philippines, Brazil, and Mexico are the ones who are interested in buying this vaccine.
So you mentioned that India is still looking for the data of the vaccine. What is India's plans once it gets the data?
So now that it has received what my sources say is a comprehensive data, there are two possibilities. First is to conduct a phase 3 trial in India, like how you have for the Oxford AstraZeneca trial, which is happening here. The regulator will look into the data and accordingly decide the phase 3 of clinical trial in terms of how many participants, where all it has to be done. Second is that wait for the clinical trials, basic clinical trials which are happening abroad of the same vaccine, and then tie up with a company here and either produce the vaccine directly here, or what is we call as the fill and finish process. That means the vaccine comes here, but the companies here just fill and finish the vaccine and you administer. So these are the two options. But this is too early to right now come to a conclusion. We have to wait and watch what the experts here are going to look at the phase 1, phase 2 data. The most likely plausibility could be that India could on its own conduct a phase 3 trial of this vaccine.
And what are the sort of big questions that still remain unanswered that will definitely, a country like India would require for the next phase to start?
So the big questions is basically on 3 aspects: the adverse reactions, the immune response, and the safety. All the 3 aspects are very important because it's been done with just 70 odd patients. So that how statistically significant it is to use for public use is still the biggest question mark. So in that sense, that's why I'm telling that it could be maybe a phase 2 again or a phase 3. Because if you look at our own trials that are happening, we have a very large number, who are there even in the phase 2 of the trials. This number is very low for a phase 2 is what is there. Even the Bharat Biotech vaccine goes into thousands even in the phase 2. So maybe looking at the data, they would go for phase 2 again, or maybe phase 3. But the biggest question mark is safety and adverse reaction.
Dear listeners, sorry for this interruption, but before we move on to the rest of the show, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there is perhaps no other place that does that better than Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of Indian Express, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and access the coverage 24/7. Explained by Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. Next, we talk about the legal provision Act of God or force majeure. During the COVID-19 pandemic, economies of countries across the world have taken a significant hit, and businesses have faced severe losses. And having faced such losses, many of them have considered the legal provision of Act of God to cut down their losses or get out of contractual obligations. Earlier this year, IPL was considering it when looking at player contracts. Recently, the construction giant Larsen & Toubro had considered it, and the country's biggest gas importer, Petronet LNG, had also invoked it on some of its cargo. But there is also one more recent example just from last week.
So the most recent context is, of course, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said that the economy is facing an act of God-like situation when she talked about why there is a shortfall in GST collections.
That's Apurva Vishwanath, who covers law for the Indian Express, and she's talking to us about Act of God.
And this shortfall in GST collections is the reason that the center is saying that the states will have to borrow and the center will not be able to help. And of course, it is being talked about in the wake of this COVID-19 pandemic about getting out of certain contractual obligations that one must perform.
Here's what Nirmala Sitharaman had said during the 41st GST Council meeting last week.
This year, we are facing an extraordinary situation that even below the 10% approximate estimation, you're facing an act of God, which might even result in a contraction of the economy.
In this segment, we talk to Apurva about what Act of God is and what situations qualify for it.
Basically, the law of contracts is built around this premise that whatever you have agreed to in a contract, the parties must perform. So this rule is the fundamental basis on which everything in contract law is defined. But when a party fails to perform, what happens is a real question in regular business. So one of those exceptions the law carves out is the use of act of God or force majeure. So say an event which is completely out of control of the party involved, and because of this completely unforeseen event, the party is not able to perform their contractual obligation. So that is what act of God is, and the clause is present in most contracts in a very specific way.
Right. And so what would be an example of that? Would something like floods and earthquakes, which are out of human control, essentially qualify for Act of God or force majeure?
See, for example, force majeure and act of God are two terms that are used interchangeably, but force majeure has sort of a wider connotation. So while act of God means any naturally occurring event, like all those things that you mentioned, earthquake, floods, a tsunami, or a cyclone and things like that, force majeure would be insurance against riots or change in government policy or a war, man-made or events that have human intervention in it. So all of these things are usually at the end of contracts, you would have a clause which would list out all these things and also add for extra measure that including all these things, but not limited to, the clause comes with that sort of legal language which accounts for a lot of unforeseen things. For example, if there's a cargo that is bringing goods from Africa, it would be protected against shipwreck, it would be protected against pirates, and very specific things like that. So in case something goes wrong, in case these unforeseen events actually happen, then the party can say, we couldn't perform our part of the contract because of act of God or force majeure. And then the party will not have to pay damages or make good the loss that the other party has incurred.
So can pandemics be counted, as an act of God? Like, have they been included in any contracts? Is there any precedent to it?
Of course, pandemics can be enumerated in a force majeure clause, but it's not as simple as just naming COVID-19 as a reason for why you couldn't perform your part of the obligation. The law requires very specific measures. So, for example, when you say that I couldn't deliver my goods to the buyer because of the COVID-19 pandemic, that wouldn't be sufficient. It would come down to whether there was a local lockdown that or a restriction in movement that was imposed in the place where the sale had to happen, and if that specific time coincided and you had no other opportunity to do it. So basically you should have tried every other resort and then finally given up saying this is impossible to perform. So pandemics can be counted as force majeure, but it's very specific. It has to be brought down to the last detail. For example, if a business is no longer profitable because of the restrictions, because of the lockdown, let's say movement of goods, transport of goods is costing you more, and the business is no longer profitable for you, you cannot cite act of God as an excuse to get out of the contractual obligation. Even if you incur losses, even if there is no profitability, you still have to make all attempts to perform your part of the contract. Otherwise, the party will be liable to pay damages to the other party. So broadly, pandemics generally, yes, but in each case, each circumstance, it will have to be negotiated by the parties, and all these aspects will have to be looked into.
So, in this case where Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman is talking about act of God, what are the sort of implications of that if, let's say, the center invokes an act of God or force majeure? What implications could that have on, other people and other situations?
No, with regard to GST, it does put a lot of other transactions under the scanner. For example, experts have told us that invocation of force majeure can possibly be done for payment of salaries. But this is something that is a statutory obligation for the center as well. So the state can't tell you that it can't pay salaries because of the pandemic. So the question still remains in law, where do you draw the line? A pandemic or a pandemic-induced economic downfall is not the first time. You would have had something like an earthquake or floods or similar events, which can all be counted as act of God. But did the center plead act of God in such situations? So a lot of these questions are still available. So this could end up as a federal issue that is highly contested between states, especially opposition ruled states, and the center. And if the question still remains legally, if the center cites act of God or the pandemic as an act of God, then what stops the states from doing the same and getting out of their own obligations? Or what happens if all borrowers start doing that in banking? Also, in law, it should be written somewhere that the center can refuse to pay the states in the event of an act of God. So there are lots of these legal questions that still remain, and experts are sort of watching this situation because it is unprecedented that a sovereign would cite act of God to get out of its obligations.
Next, we talk about Novak Djokovic. Yesterday, the world number one and an overwhelming favorite was kicked out of the US Open for accidentally hitting a line judge in the throat with a tennis ball. Djokovic had been playing against Pablo Carreño Busta and was frustrated that he was broken at a crucial stage during the match. In frustration, he walked back to the baseline, took the ball that was in his pocket and without looking, hit it fairly hard towards the left corner. The ball caught the line umpire square in the neck and she immediately tumbled to the ground, clutching at the point of impact. Djokovic immediately raised his arm in apology but was later defaulted by the tournament referee. A default is a rare punishment handed out to players and can be done because of either a single deed or through a collection of warnings that include verbal, ball, racket abuse, unsportsmanlike conduct, and other offences. And Djokovic's actions, regardless of whether it was intentional or not, fit the rules for a default. His behaviour has been considered dangerous in the past as well. Like when back in 2016 French Open, after missing out on a breakpoint opportunity, he got angry and flung his racket backwards without looking, nearly hitting one of the line judges. That same year, in the ATP finals, he had hit a ball into the stand, but neither had resulted in a default. In fact, when he was asked about the ATP incident later during a press conference, he said, quote, "It is not an issue for me. It's not the first time I did it," unquote. His removal from the US Open marks a stunning end to his 29-match winning streak and a bid for an 18th Grand Slam title. And this also means that there will now emerge a first-time men's singles Grand Slam champion, considering Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer are not playing in the tournament. You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and as always was edited and mixed by our producer Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explain section. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explain and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like this show, then you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.